It's the week of Valentine's Day, and whether you're spending the week with someone special or spending it cuddled up with a tissue box, this week is all about appreciating love. So in the spirit of the Feast of St. Valentine, I'm going to be showing some love to the games that I feel are very underappreciated. As the title of this video says, some of these are genuinely disliked by most people, so if you're someone who can't handle a differing opinion, please prepare yourself. However, I will admit some of these games definitely aren't hated, rather they are just underrated or underappreciated in my opinion. And a couple of them are just more obscure games where I often feel like I'm the only one who actually played them. So without further ado, let's get into it with the first game I want to talk about today, The Outer Worlds. Now, I wouldn't say The Outer Worlds is a very hated game, but just a pretty underrated one in my opinion. Most people seem to view this as just an okay game. I don't hear a ton of people talk about it, and it seems to have been kind of forgotten since its release back in 2019. It just came and went for a lot of people, but not for me. I absolutely love The Outer Worlds. The Outer Worlds was developed by one of my favorite game developers, Obsidian Entertainment. Their most relevant work to this discussion is of course Fallout New Vegas. Although many people will consider New Vegas to be the best Fallout game in the series, Obsidian was never given a chance to make another one. And despite making one of the best games in the genre, Obsidian didn't make another first-person action RPG for nearly 10 years. But finally, they announced they would be giving the genre another spin when they unveiled The Outer Worlds at the Game Awards 2018. The game immediately garnered a lot of hype, partly because Tim Kaine, the original creator of Fallout, would be heavily involved with the project. The hype was super high, with many expecting a game that could rival the greatness of New Vegas. The game launched in October 2019 and got very high review scores, sitting at an 85 on Metacritic. So at this point, you're probably wondering why The Outer Worlds is even on this list. Well, the fan reception to the game was a lot more mixed than the reviewers. A simple Google search of The Outer Worlds bad will show you the scathing Reddit posts, Steam reviews, and YouTube video essays. The primary complaints were that the game just didn't really add much new to the genre, and the story was a bit of a mess, with fake choices that don't actually affect anything in a meaningful way. On top of that, there were a good amount of technical problems at launch, with inconsistent AI and performance issues. After playing the game, I was honestly extremely surprised to see that there was such a large group of people who vehemently dislike it. Maybe it's because of the way I played it. I didn't play it when it first came out, I played it a year or so later and got it discounted alongside a buy two get one sale. So I feel like everything I'm gonna say next should be taken with that context in mind. The Outer Worlds immediately hooked me when I played it. I think the characters are fantastic, they're super well written, and I found myself very fond of them. And overall, that was the thing that carried me through the game. I do agree with some of the complaints about the combat, it definitely was nothing special. I also don't remember any of these awful AI moments people have talked about. It's possible I just forgot, or maybe they had been patched by the time I played. But regardless, it clearly didn't hurt my experience all that much. The game is also pretty funny in my opinion, which is something I wish more games did. Everything is always so serious, we need more comedic games like this. The Outer Worlds is far from a revolutionary game, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm surprised it's not more well liked. If you haven't played it, I would highly recommend picking it up if you see it for a good price. However, be aware that the remastered version found on PS5 and Series X apparently runs pretty poorly, so I would recommend sticking with the original Steam, PS4, Xbox One release. If you're in the mood for a more lighthearted action RPG, I think you'll enjoy yourself. The next game I want to talk about is Battlefield Hardline. If you ask a Battlefield fan about Hardline, they will usually shudder in fear. Hardline takes pretty much everything that defines Battlefield as a franchise and gets rid of it. Sounds awful, right? Well, the thing is, I'm a Call of Duty guy. I prefer the more close-range, chaotic gameplay you get from COD as opposed to the large-scale Battlefield style. So that's why it's really no surprise that I actually loved Battlefield Hardline. Less emphasis on vehicles? I'm listening. More emphasis on fun and chaos as opposed to tactical realism? Sounds good to me. Smaller maps? Yeah, that works for my rotted COD brain. Essentially, anything that would be considered a negative to a hardcore Battlefield fan was a plus for me. It shouldn't be all too surprising that Battlefield Hardline is so different, considering it was not developed by DICE. I think EA wanted to try and replicate the COD formula where multiple developers would work on the series in order to get more games out quicker. The first developer EA chose to man the Battlefield franchise was the now defunct Visceral Games. They were best known for the Dead Space trilogy and didn't have much experience making FPS games. They had made a couple James Bond games and assisted on the endgame DLC for Battlefield 3, but that was about it. They were certainly a very talented team, but I'm not entirely sure why EA chose them as the developers to go with. That's probably a big reason why they weren't quite able to recapture that Battlefield feeling that the hardcore fans wanted. Overall, I think Visceral Games did an okay job for what was really their first major FPS project, but there were some negatives. The campaign is definitely a bit strange, going for a Miami Vice-style cop drama story. It's not awful, but it does feel pretty lackluster compared to the spectacle vehicles we are used to from FPS campaigns. I don't know why I did this, but I'm pretty sure I have played through this campaign twice, and I still can't remember a single character or a single thing that happened, which is definitely not a good sign. However, I play FPS games for the multiplayer, and I just thought it was an absolute blast. My personal favorite mode was called Hotwire, which I think perfectly encapsulates Battlefield Hardline. It was a mode that works similarly to a hardpoint mode, where there are points you need to control. However, in Hotwire, the points are not stationary, they are vehicles on the map. Marked vehicles would spawn, and if you drove the car at a certain speed, you would start gaining points for your team. It was so thrilling being in one of the marked cars and driving around while the whole enemy team tried to take you down. And on the other end, there was nothing more satisfying than blowing up a marked car with your RPG as it zoomed by you. Ultimately, I totally understand why a hardcore Battlefield fan would hate this game, but for someone like me who actually prefers this style of game, it was awesome. I honestly started to get pretty nostalgic for this game as I wrote this, which surprised me. I didn't really expect that, but at the same time I get it because I spent a lot of time with this game. I would never try to pretend that this is a great Battlefield game, but as a goofy, chaotic, fun FPS game, Battlefield Hardline hit just right for me. I'm a little scared to talk about this next one because I know how passionate its fan base can be, but the next game on my list is Pokemon Sword and Shield. I do recognize the faults with this game. It didn't make a ton of improvements on the Pokemon formula, and for this game to be the first mainline Pokemon game on a home console, it certainly didn't feel much different than what we had gotten on the 3DS. But you know what? I enjoyed this game a lot. Pokemon was a childhood favorite of mine. There was almost no other franchise that captured my imagination more than Pokemon. If you went back and asked 10-year-old me what my favorite video game was, I probably would have said Mario, but Pokemon was no doubt a close second. However, when I got Pokemon Shield back in 2019, I had been going through a bit of a drought with this franchise. I had skipped out on a couple entries such as Sun and Moon and Let's Go Pikachu Eevee. I had played Omega Ruby but never actually finished it. Simply put, I was in the mood to play Pokemon again, and Pokemon Sword and Shield perfectly scratched that itch. I fully completed it, making it the first Pokemon game I had fully completed since, man, probably Pokemon X and Y. Like I said, I get that this game didn't innovate much, but it gave me the fun Pokemon gameplay I was looking for. And to be perfectly honest, I enjoyed this game more than both Legends Arceus and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. I respect both of those entries for trying something new and aiming to move the franchise forward. I'm not even necessarily saying that Sword and Shield are better than those games, but what I am saying is that I enjoyed Sword and Shield more for giving me what I wanted from a traditional Pokemon game. I think fans were a little tough on this one when it came out, and I'm already starting to see the narrative shifting that way, with conversations about if the game was really that bad. I think it was just a situation where Pokemon fans were understandably looking for something a bit bigger with more innovation, but I still thoroughly enjoyed my time with Pokemon Sword and Shield. The main criticism I do agree with though is that the game is stupidly easy. This has to be the easiest Pokemon game ever made. Apparently they wanted to simplify Pokemon for younger fans, which is hilarious to hear considering myself and literally all of my friends played Pokemon at like 8 years old and understood it perfectly. So once again, I can totally understand how a hardcore Pokemon fan got super turned off by this. It probably made the game super boring for them. But again, it had been a few years since I was super invested in Pokemon, so that's why I think it was easier for me to look past this lack of difficulty. Despite all of the very apparent faults, I honestly consider it to be my favorite Pokemon game on the Switch, and I'll be interested to see if more people start to come around on it in the coming years. Now let's talk about a couple multiplayer games that may or may not even be playable anymore. I often feel like I'm one of the only people who ever actually played these games and enjoyed them. The first is LawBreakers. LawBreakers was created by Cliff Bleszinski, the same guy who brought us Gears of War, so it was pretty exciting to hear that he would be creating a new shooter IP. Unlike Gears, LawBreakers would be a first-person game and focus on multiplayer. LawBreakers is a traditional class-based FPS game, but what sets it apart was its advanced movement combined with low-gravity elements. The development of this game was quite a story and could probably be an entire video on its own. A few things that I think are worth noting is that the game was initially supposed to be free-to-play, but later became a paid release. Also, the game did not come to Xbox consoles, which disappointed many of Cliff's diehard fans who had followed him since Gears of War. On top of that, Blizzard had just released Overwatch, which had taken the gaming world by storm. All of this combined into an unfortunate release that came and went very quickly. LawBreakers was just never able to garner the audience necessary to survive and ended up being shut down barely a year after release. Literally no one bought this game. Except for me. I was immediately attracted to LawBreakers from the day it was announced. Not only am I a huge FPS guy, but I always gravitate to class-based and arena-style FPS games. And that's exactly what LawBreakers was going to bring. The game launched and I was there day one, and I genuinely really enjoyed it. I think the game is just super cool and the movement was really impressive. If anything, I think LawBreakers may have been a bit ahead of its time in that aspect, as movement has become a key element to success for many FPS games such as Apex Legends or the Finals. I think part of the reason reason this game struggled to find an audience was just because people were so obsessed with Overwatch at the time. People could not stop comparing this game to Overwatch, and Cliff definitely played into that himself. However, these games don't even really play similarly at all. To me, the gameplay of LawBreakers was way closer to something like Quake than Overwatch. So that whole comparison and quote-unquote rivalry between LawBreakers and Overwatch was pretty stupid and really only existed because the games just so happened to be marketed at the same time. And I do think changing the game from a free-to-play release was a big mistake, as it would have immediately brought in so many new players to try the game instead of having the game basically be dead on arrival. I didn't play this game for hundreds of hours or anything, but I did really enjoy my time with it. Sadly, the servers are long gone because I really could see myself going back to it from time to time. But Cliff was recently teasing on Twitter that LawBreakers could make a return someday. Personally, I highly doubt that will ever actually happen, but if it did, I could see LawBreakers finding more success now than it did back in 2016. Like I said, I think LawBreakers may have just been a little bit ahead of its time, and with the uptick in advanced movement FPS games combined with the lack of arena shooters on the market, I think LawBreakers could find a place in the gaming landscape. But for now, LawBreakers is just a distant memory I have from the summer of 2017. Okay, so LawBreakers is pretty obscure in the sense that nobody played it, but I do think most gamers have at least heard of it, especially if you were engaged with gaming media in 2017. So let's get even more obscure with a game called Disc Jam. Disc Jam is a fairly unknown multiplayer game that was released in 2017. Inspired by Windbreakers, Disc Jam was a game that I would best describe as a futuristic combination of tennis and volleyball. I feel like no one really knows this game ever even existed. However, I played it because it was available as a free game for PlayStation Plus subscribers back in March 2017. Me and my friends hopped in to try it because why not? And we actually fell in love with the game. Disc Jam has a lot of similar qualities to something like Rocket League, in the sense that it may look simple on the surface, but those who play the game a lot know how intricate it can really get. You would toss the disc back and forth with a variety of different shots that could be chosen by changing your inputs. As the rally between players continued, the disc would move faster and the points awarded would rise. The game was a total blast with friends and could get super intense as the rallies and the matches escalated. I'm pretty surprised this game didn't catch on more, considering other multiplayer games that use the PS Plus model such as Rocket League or Fall Guys were able to achieve huge levels of success. I think Disc Jam's biggest flaw was just that there wasn't a ton of gameplay available other than simply playing matches. So unless your friend group got super into it like mine did, you probably just played a couple matches and then never went back. As the player count dwindled, the developers weren't able to keep the game consistently updated and ended up shutting down the online servers in September 2022. Despite this, they still charged $15 for the game, which feels pretty scummy. But if you do ever see the game heavily discounted, I would highly recommend getting it and inviting some friends over for a game night. I guarantee you will have a great time. The last multiplayer game I want to talk about today is a more recent one, and one where the servers are actually still online. PlayStation's Destruction All-Stars had a very rocky development. Originally slated as a $70 launch title, it was delayed to February 2021. At the same time, it was announced that the game would no longer be fully priced $70, and on top of that, it would launch day one on PS Plus. That showed an extreme lack of confidence from Sony, but when Destruction All-Stars did finally release in February 2021, I hopped in and gave it a shot. And although it was far from perfect, I actually had a good amount of fun with it. Destruction All-Stars is a vehicular combat game with a variety of different classes, each with unique abilities and characteristics. As the name of the game and the genre implies, most of your time is spent slamming your car into enemy players. However, the main thing that set this game apart was that your character could also jump out of the car, giving you even more unique abilities. For example, I found a character named Muna, who had an ability where she could activate traps by walking over them. This helped me dominate the free-for-all mode, where I could use this ability and walk over all of the traps in the arena and rack up tons of points as other players slammed into them. I thought it was really cool how they designed a character who was actually more effective on her feet rather than in the car. That's something I wouldn't have expected coming in, and it felt very rewarding to find this strategy and learn where the most effective traps were on the map that would attract the most traffic. On top of that, the game has a lot of charm and style with beautiful colors that jump off the screen. However, Destruction All-Stars really failed to gain a large audience, despite being free for PS Plus members for 2 months instead of the usual 1 month. Part of the reason for this was simply because the game was far from perfect. My main complaints being a lack of variety with the modes and also a nearly non-existent single-player experience. However, I think the biggest reason this game failed was because it was a PS5 only title released in early 2021. This was the era where it was still pretty difficult to find a PS5, so the install base just wasn't there yet. So when you release an already niche game, make it primarily multiplayer, and then release it for just one console with a relatively small number of players, you're asking for disaster. By the time PS5s were readily available and most people who wanted one had one, Destruction All-Stars was long past its free PS Plus timeframe and now costs $20. None of these new PS5 owners are jumping into the game because no one is playing it anymore. I think this game really could have benefited from a PS4 or a PC version being released. It's a shame because I think developer Lucid Games had some good ideas here, and I do think they created a fun game. However, a lot of poor circumstances led to this game being pretty much dead on arrival. Speaking of games that were released with a lot of poor circumstances, let's talk about the Xbox One exclusive Sunset Overdrive. Man oh man, do I love Sunset Overdrive. A third-person action game where you take on a city infested by mutants, the game combines flashy movement with wacky weapons to be an all-around blast to play. Everything about this game is insane. It's the type of game where you can feel the passion and fun the developers had while making it. At this point, I'd say Sunset Overdrive is a pretty well-known game and everyone pretty much agrees that it's great. However, that doesn't mean a lot of people played it. The game struggled to sell just 1 million copies and it was barely profitable for its developer Insomniac Games. And yes, you heard me correctly, Insomniac Games developed an Xbox One exclusive. This was right before PlayStation bought them and officially made them a first-party developer. So yeah, Insomniac had actually partnered with Xbox on this one, which I do think really hurt the game. The name Insomniac Games doesn't mean anything to Xbox players in the way it does to PlayStation players. Insomniac has a history with PlayStation and will easily be able to garner an audience for any of their games there. But that's a little bit harder to do with Xbox players since the only Insomniac game they've ever been able to play was Fuse. On top of that, the game released early on in the Xbox One generation. So similar to what we just said with Destruction All-Stars, the install base just wasn't there yet. It was later released on PC, but still didn't seem to garner much of an audience. It's one of those times for me where I play a game and wonder if everyone else is playing the same game as me. Because to me, this is one of the premier action games from the PS4 Xbox One generation. But most people seem to barely even remember it exists. Insomniac does hold the rights to the Sunset Overdrive IP, meaning a return is not fully out of the question. At the very least, I would like to see them do a Sunset Overdrive remaster on PS5 and give PlayStation players the chance to check out the only Insomniac game not playable on PlayStation. Okay, it's time for the final game I want to talk about in this video, one that I have been dreading. So far, we've kind of been beating around the bush, talking about games that are pretty well liked but just not popular, or games that are considered just okay. But now it's time for the big one. I liked the Devil May Cry reboot. I remember the barrage of hate this game got back in the day from the moment it was announced. Devil May Cry fans were furious, but luckily for me, I'm not a Devil May Cry fan. Well, let me be more specific. I had never played DMC at the time of this reboot, so seeing some of the major changes they had made didn't really mean anything to me. I know people's biggest gripe with this reboot is how they changed Dante, and yeah, even as someone who likes this game, you can take one look at these character designs and see there was a downgrade here. The characters and story in general are really the major downfall of this game because it's just not very good. But you know what is good? Playing an action game where you beat the hell out of people with hardcore rock music blaring in the background. And ultimately, that's what the DMC reboot is for me. It's a fun, turn your brain off kind of game where you mow down enemies and listen to some killer music. I think a lot of my nostalgia for this game simply comes from this era of hack and slash action games. I'm a sucker for any game in this style, whether it's Bayonetta, Metal Gear Rising, or yes, the DMC reboot. I'm sorry, but this style just really speaks to me. It gives my brain good endorphins, and I wish there were more of them nowadays. I completely understand why a hardcore fan of Devil May Cry hates this game, but as a hack and slash action game, I think the DMC reboot is actually pretty damn good. So that's my list of games I love that everyone else hates. What did you think of my list? And let me know some games that you love that no one else does in the comments below.